Haidete o Philoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, The Manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I'm talking with Timothy Brady, who has just published a new kind of reader. It's called Reading Greek with the Desert Fathers, an intermediate Greek reader. And that's published through Sojourner Press, like you'll hear in the episode. What's interesting about this reader is it's aimed at first-year Greek students. So those who have finished a year of, seminary Greek, again, looking at Koine Greek specifically. But rather than drawing from Septuagint or the Church Fathers or other New Testament texts, it's drawing from outside of that corpus, specifically from the Desert Fathers. And he's taking these texts and leveling them so that they're appropriate for someone who's finished a year of New Testament Greek. I think that's pretty cool. We discuss his approach, how he did that, and then we spend the second half of the episode talking about essentially lexicography. How do you manage building manage phrases and keeping track of which phrases are appropriate to a given period of Greek, and how might we use these in, our own active Greek and filling in gaps and things, and how do we know that this phrase we're using is as authentic as we can be as, non-native speakers roughly 2 millennia later. So it's an interesting episode, and I hope it will spark some discussion and hopefully some new innovations in our community, not only in terms of perhaps some new readers and things, but, some better lexicon and vocabulary resources for those of us who want to use Greek in active ways. So I hope you enjoy the episode and my discussion with Timothy. Well, hi Timothy. It's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I know you've written a book, an intermediate Greek reader, which is really cool, and we have some other cool topics to talk about. So yeah, thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I think you contacted me a couple of months ago about the book you're working on, and you were kind enough to send me an advance copy. And I haven't had a chance to finish reading it, but it's really cool. Because you said you've taken like the Desert Fathers, but then you've taken that and adapted it down to something that like you say like a first or second year Greek student would be able to read, and get a taste of some like non-biblical Greek without having to, have as much vocabulary and stuff like that. So you want to give me a rundown of the book again and make sure I haven't just misrepresented what you've done?
No, that's really good. So the book is called Reading Greek with the Desert Fathers, an intermediate Greek reader, published by Sojourner Press. And basically, it's in the title, it's a Greek reader. It's supposed to bridge the gap between early Greek students. So ideally, first year was kind of what I had in mind, having finished 2 semesters at undergrad or seminary or something, ancient Greek, and then bridging the gap between that and live texts. So kind of I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with Dick and Jane books, but those books that we use to teach children how to read more complex language.
Yes.
So what I did was some of the vignettes from the Desert Fathers, who are essentially the first wave of Christian monasticism in the 4th century. They settled in the Egyptian wilderness and also in parts of Israel, and we have a whole corpus of really interesting little stories, sayings, little snippets that have been collected about them and by them and passed on the order of a. And so I just basically selected 30 of those that I found interesting and thought would do well for this purpose, and I adapted them down to an easier Greek level. So that essentially consists in taking out difficult vocabulary and substituting it with words that might be more familiar to early Greek students, and especially students of the New Testament. That was the pool of vocabulary that I drew from. And also, occasionally, I would tweak the grammar if there were post biblical koine features cropping up. I tried to norm those to what we see in the New Testament. That was kind of the base um, of yeah the standard that I used, and I was able to get it down to 95% vocabulary from the New Testament, and specifically from the 50 most common words in the New Testament. So many first century seminary courses are sorry, many first two semester seminary courses will have you learn all the words that crop up 50 times or more in the New Testament. And so I was able to make the bulk of the reading consist in that vocabulary, and the extra 5% I was able to draw from elsewhere in the New Testament. So
I think,
yeah,
isn't it like I forget the term, isn't it Zipf's law or something like that, that basically says like every time you go down on an occurrence, you're like doubling or whatever. It's growing exponentially. So like the jump from 100 to 50 is a boatload of new terms, but 50 to 49 is massive. So you're actually, by picking 50, you've made the barrier of entry significantly lower than if it was at 25 or 10 or something, because there's just thousands of less words you'd have to know, right?
yeah, there's about I came up with about 294 lexemes that show up uh, 50 times or more
Wow.
in the New Testament, not counting proper nouns. So I left in proper nouns because they're pretty
Right. It's
transparent.
pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Well,
So
so really
yeah, so
that's not that hard.
yeah, it people might be a little daunted because the grammar can still be kind of complex, because there will be, like in any real text, there will be random participles and perfect forms that you might not be familiar with. But the idea is, if you have a good handle on the vocabulary, then you can kind of muscle your way through
Well,
unfamiliar constructions
yeah.
and piece it together from the context. And I've also included in the back of the book kind of a collection of translations of the different stories, so you can check your work if you need to. I tried to make it a little less accessible so people wouldn't be tempted to, kind of like their eye wouldn't automatically flit down to the bottom of the page. And
Right. So they're not facing like you would have like a low edition or however you say lube
mhm,
or how do you say
exactly.
that word? I've still never got a handle on it.
I say lobe.
Oh,
I don't know
okay.
where it comes from though.
Yeah. I need to look that up. Maybe. So it's not facing, right? Like you actually have to turn to the back of the book to find the translation, but it's still there if a reader wanted it.
Yeah, it's still there if the reader wanted it, and the 5% of vocabulary that occurs less than 50 times in the New Testament, I have glossed at the bottom of the page in English. So I'll underline it and put a little footnote, and
Okay.
then gloss that at the bottom of the page. So I found that it keeps the page pretty streamlined, and there's enough white space so that it doesn't scare off a newcomer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have those words that might be just beyond your reach available, and it doesn't jerk you out of the reading flow. The idea is to keep you in the Greek as much as possible, and just help you gain some, because that's I've discovered through my time in Greek education that tends to be a flaw in much contemporary Greek instruction, is that you spend a lot of time on grammar, and what kind of falls by the wayside is actual experience in the language
Hmm.
and just time on task, getting the reps in, reading, encountering strange forms, and so for instance, if there's a form of the verb that is ambiguous, that could be one thing or could be another thing, but the one thing occurs 9 times out of 10, the other thing only occurs one time out of 10. Um, you won't really know that if you just learn it as a vocab word in
Hmm.
isolation, like from a deck of cards or something. What the way to acquire that is by just plowing through a lot of text, and then it'll be pretty obvious to you that the one keeps occurring over and over and over again, and you've just acquired that passively, and you're just consuming a lot of text. You're encountering lots of features. It's a I liken it to like a full body workout. Reading is like the push up of language exercises, because
Hmm.
you work out your vocab, you kind of forge ahead into slightly unknown territory, ideally not too much, but you encounter new phenomena and new grammatical constructions, and you just reinforce at random all the stuff that you've been learning already. So it has a very good way of solidifying in your mind what you've already learned on paper.
Well, like the last episode I had with Michael Kopp, he said if you then add reading out loud,
Mm.
you're incorporating, output and listen. I mean, listening, maybe in air quotes, in a sense,
Mm.
you're engaging other language skills in addition to just the reading skill, which is pretty cool. Um,
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for reading out loud.
mhm.
I mean, famously in antiquity, you hear a lot that they only read out loud, uh, and so you might just want to recreate that. That might have value in and of itself to understand better the rhetorical features
Mm.
and homonyms and synonyms. It might even you might be able to catch that out for for greater understanding of the text. But there's also the so-called phonological loop,
Yep.
which is which is basically to compress it down. I might be missing some important aspects of it, but the idea is that your brain stores like on a very very tight band um, stores the information that you read phonologically. So you're basically saying it to yourself
Oh
inside
yeah.
your head as you read something at speed, at normal speed. And so that's how your brain puts together pieces of larger discourse, like a sentence or a paragraph or even a whole book. And the problem is if you drop below a certain speed, then
Mm.
your brain's working overtime to try to compensate for not having that phonological loop, not feeding in uh, more more content into that, and so you end up not understanding as well what you're reading if you read it too slowly, which is a little counterintuitive because you'd imagine that the slower you read, the better you understand, but uh, it doesn't always work like that.
Yeah, and
So
that makes
so
that makes
yeah,
a lot of sense.
just to put a point on it, then the benefit of reading aloud would be to give you greater facility sounding out words,
Mhm.
and just have a clear mental representation in your mind, um, of how you would speak what you are reading.
What I think, again, I mentioned Paul Nation's stuff a lot. He talks about fluency development. So, you know, if you part of your language time or your study time could be as simple as taking a text you've already read and then trying to read it out loud and read it out loud a little bit faster, and then read it again a little bit faster, and not worry so much about comprehension, but like you said, just being able to pronounce it and read the words properly, because that's giving you that facility with reading and in comfort with just figuring out what things are. So then when you go back to read for comprehension, you can get that phonological
Mm.
loop, firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, I find the only difficulty with going back over text that you've already read, possibly multiple times, is that you just tend to lose interest in it, or
That's
I
true.
do at least. I get bored with stuff, and so then if my drive to go back over it again is less because it's not new, it's not interesting information. So maybe it takes a little discipline at that point to drill down and develop more fluency. But I mean, another way to handle that would be to just have similar texts at a similar level with similar features,
Yeah.
but new content. And we're nowhere near there for ancient Greek right now, but that's something that this.
So I'm curious. I'm looking at some of these. I've opened your book, and the first one's about a paragraph, and the second one's maybe a long paragraph, and then there's some varying lengths in these, and there's some shorter ones after. How did you decide to order the various vignettes?
Good question. They are not progressive. They don't go from shorter to longer, from easier to harder. Um, I tried to um, Yeah, there's not a real strict ordering principle, but I tried to introduce new information, new characters. So,
Hmm.
for instance, if you're familiar with early Gnosticism, monasticism, you may have heard of Father Anthony of the Desert.
Yeah.
He's considered the pioneer of Christian monasticism. And so in one of the early stories, I introduced Abba Anthony, and then he crops up later a couple of times in later stories. But I didn't want to have a story with him without having given like a little blurb at the beginning of the story introducing him. And so moving on, you know this character and you're familiar with him. And also there are a couple of places. So like the setting for some of these stories is or a certain mountain or something. So I wanted to have the reader be familiar with that just for contextual knowledge. But other than that, it's a little haphazard. So yeah, you can basically dive in anywhere that looks interesting to you. The other thing is I tried to the the titles of the stories are in English, and I tried to make them interesting and kind of hook your imagination. So it's possible that you may just be going through the table of contents and find something that catches your eye, and want to dive in there. So I wanted to make that an option too.
And I like one of the things you've given too is before some of the stories, there's like a sentence or two in
Mm-hmm.
English kind of explaining a little bit about maybe the place of the character or something, which I feel like that's really helpful, especially like for me who I know a little bit about the Desert Fathers, but not massive amount. And so it's cool to have that context, which then helps make the Greek more comprehensible because I kind of know, oh, this is in a desert or this is, so I can kind of predict what vocabulary and things I might encounter. So I think that's really
Yeah,
helpful too.
there are different ways to. I believe it's called scaffolding.
Yeah.
There are different ways to provide context for a text in a foreign language to make it easier for someone to understand. So you can do this with pictures. You can do this with glosses at the bottom of the page with a facing translation, or like I did with a little blurb at the beginning, kind of giving some context. But yeah, the idea is so that the reader isn't approaching the text blind, so that they have kind of an idea in their mind of what the text might be about. That's why the title is also in English, just to kind of make that transition as easy as possible.
So I'm curious. As you were talking about, you've essentially taken these original texts and leveled them down.
Hmm.
It reminded me. I think I've seen maybe it's Carla Hurt. I think was doing this with Latin, where like
Mm,
she's taken I think some part of the Aeneid, and I apologize to Carla if I'm getting this wrong. But yeah, she's got like three or four levels of the same text,
mm.
various levels of complexity. So, is it something where like maybe in the future someone could take what you've done and then take the originals and like fit a level in between that? Or is that,
Hmm.
what's the if I wanted to then go read the originals for these stories, like how big a jump is that going to be?
Yeah. So that would definitely be possible. So the originals, just a little quick publisher. So I'm publishing with Sojourner Press, and on the website you can buy the book, but there's also a link to a PDF of the original texts.
Hmm.
So and they're numbered according to the numbering that I use in the book. So you can hold up your copy of the leveled text up to the original if you want to kind of compare where I
That's
simplified
cool.
what. And yeah, you'll notice that I've occasionally there are concepts and terms that don't pop up and that don't show up in the New Testament. So I've had to make a few changes to the content of the stories too, but I've tried to be as conservative as possible. But anyway, that would be an option if you read the stories in here, you like them, but you want a challenge, you can try to understand the original. There's also a link on the website to a digital copy of the book, and you can download that for free. You can get it as a PDF. Um, and yeah, we're just trying to make that available to as many people as possible. So I'm in grad school. I know that finances can be tight sometimes, and yeah, we're just trying to allow other people to have a resource for their Greek journey. So yeah, if you want a paperback copy, you can order it, but you can also just access the PDF. Um, yeah, so that would be where one would go if they wanted to like create like a level higher than this, like
Mhm.
less simplified, or even a level lower with like I don't know, maybe the 20 most common words in the New Testament.
Yeah.
I must say, I it it was difficult to write a story with such limited vocabulary. Even in your native language, it can be difficult to express things with, it feels like writing with one hand behind your back. Um, yeah, but one thing I might be concerned, or not concerned, but would want to flag for someone who's creating different levels of the same text is just the question of holding the reader's interest. I'm sure there are ways to
Mm.
do that, but I tend to have a short attention span, so I where I would put my energy would be into developing different texts that cover similar ground at a similar level than ratcheting up the same text. But I can also understand how that would be kind of it would really help the reader to yeah, it would be a lower bar to jump over, going up
Yeah.
to a higher level of the same text because you know exactly what the content is, exactly who the characters are. I can get that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the reader and, like you said, temperament. If you're like I think the two of us and get bored easily, then perhaps it's worth um, moving on to something else at a similar level. But um, reading and rereading, especially after a pause, after you've gone to something else and come back, can be helpful too sometimes. So,
Mm,
um,
yeah.
so I want to go back to you talked about so you controlled for vocabulary, right? You've limited the vocab, but the grammar is pretty much is quite
The
similar,
the
correct?
grammar's pretty raw. Yeah, like I said, occasionally there will be some post or some late features of later Koine that don't fit for my target first century and there's variation within the first century, but some features only show up later in the later development of Greek. So I I conformed those to first century Greek. But yeah, if you compare it with the originals, you'll see that the grammar is pretty pretty original. And I did that on purpose because this also saved me the trouble um of inventing uh my approximation of authentic Greek discourse features too. So like
Hmm,
constituent order that it can be difficult because there's different ideas about what is natural Greek, what is topic, what is focus in any particular passage. And so it was really nice to have authentic Greek sentences already delivered to me that I only had to adjust like the modular pieces, so like the vocabulary and occasionally some of the morphology. But I didn't rearrange much of the sentence structure and just the form of dialogue. So like um, one story might use a historical present, and then an aorist in the next sentence, and I that was kind of a freebie for me. I didn't have to use the historical presence right and then the aorist. They were just already delivered to me.
right.
And so ideally that would also yield a more authentic kind of Koine discourse.
And I'm imagining, like, as you were working with the first stories you were trying to level, it was probably difficult and you had to ask yourself a lot of questions. And then by the end, you kind of had worked out
Yeah.
what things would feel like, the kinds of substitutions and changes you were making. So it's probably much easier um, towards the end of that process.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so one thing I know we talked about initially when you mentioned the book and just before we started recording was the idea of, you know, you're trying to level this down and figure out what is authentic, um, uh, authentic Koine, or if we were going to broaden that out, authentic expressions for ancient Greek and handling, how do we, as people who want to communicate in the language, how do we do that in as authentic way as possible and just managing that information somehow. So
Mm.
how have you handled keeping track of what is 'cause I think you told me earlier that you were aiming at Gospel of John style Greek. So how
Hmm.
have you been able to track, like, this is a Gospel of John-esque expression versus a Pauline versus a, Homer kind of,
Yeah.
or, later, Athanasius or whatever, how have you approached that?
Yeah, that has been a challenge. So fortunately, I had my 294 words that I could draw from, but in terms of expressions and um, yeah, and just some of the incidental features of grammar, um, yeah, that was difficult. So I mentioned in the introduction to the book, kind of what I was aiming for was first century Greek, more specifically the Greek of the New Testament, and even more specifically the Greek of John, so the author of the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John, because it's a pretty easy John is a pretty easy on ramp to biblical Greek,
Yeah.
because his style is fairly it's fairly unornate. So he doesn't use a lot of particles. He doesn't use a lot of flashy vocabulary, um, and it tends to be very colloquial. So some things are preserved in John that are very, seem to be very much features of everyday Greek. And so that I chose that as my center because um, that seemed like the kind of Greek that would be good for beginners. So before you move on to something more difficult like Acts or the Epistle to the Hebrews, or and then move beyond to classical or Homeric Greek. Um, yeah, the challenge has been keeping track of of good, authentic Greek expressions, and there are in English there are a couple of English to Greek dictionaries, mostly from the last century or 2 centuries ago, and
Yeah, Woodhouse and
they
a couple others perhaps.
Woodhouse is the most famous one, but they, as to my knowledge, and I would love for someone to correct me on this, but to my knowledge, they're all for classical Greek, so for classical Greek composition. Um, and that classical Greek is quite close to especially the higher registers of Koine, but it can still lead you astray if you're trying to approximate like a really authentic recreation of a Koine author like I am here. So what I did was I used dictionary writing software. So field linguists use a certain kind of software when they're designing dictionaries for modern languages. And it's very, very powerful. You can key in your headwords, and then it has all sorts of different slots for grammatical information, usage, anthropological notes, also like collocations, and you can cross-reference it all to
Hmm.
different words in the collection. So it's a great place to kind of dump whatever whenever you find something interesting in your Greek reading and you're looking for and you want like a storehouse of useful phrases, expressions, useful equivalents to things that we have in English, especially like the everyday stuff. Like most even Greek experts wouldn't automatically know how to say no problem, or see you later, or something like that, in an authentic way. You could make an English calc, like translate you know out of the English into Greek, and find two words that fit together. But in terms of finding how an actual authentic Greek from the period would express this, um, there's just not a whole lot of resources. So whenever I find something like that, I'll just plop it in the dictionary and put it with an example sentence and the collocations used, and
Hmm.
how it was used. And that's been coming along. I was telling you before we started recording, I'm coming up on 4,000 headwords, and I'm really trying to privilege like the everyday stuff, the most stuff that you would use in conversation. And I imagine that other people who work with communicative or active Greek have would have like a similar collection of phrases or words. Maybe it might just be in your mind. You might not have written it down, but yeah, I would be very interested if anyone has a collection like that of just comparing notes and seeing where we could
So,
help each other like flesh it out. Especially my focus is on the Koine period, so I try to take most of my stuff from broadly around like the 300 years before and 300 years after the switch from BC to AD.
so I'm curious. I know there are some people out who, like I think of Paul Nitz, who I guess he's got some spreadsheets he
Mm,
published. Actually, I don't know if those are even live on the web anymore. I think I've added them to Google Drive ages ago or something.
mm.
But and I think he's teaching. I believe he was teaching a seminary or something or equivalent. Why why would something like that not be what you're talking about, or is it?
That is essentially what I'm talking about. I think, yeah, so I found Paul Nitz's collection. I think it's is it a Google document or a spreadsheet? Um,
Yeah, I think so, or at least it's an Excel sheet. It's either
yeah,
Google or it's downloadable. I forget.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. So that might have been what kind of gave me the idea in the first place. I forget, but I found that a few years ago. And that was really good. So that kind of illustrates my point though that lots of times when people are looking for a an equivalent to an ancient Greek expression for something or a term for something, um, there might not be like the precision of looking for like it attested in a certain period or by a certain author. So
Hmm.
like if you're looking um, to approximate like the idiom of someone like Plato or someone from the classical period, you need to be careful that you're not drawing words from Homer that were obsolete, in the classical age that aren't attested, or
Right.
words that we only find like in the later papyri from centuries afterwards that we can't assume that those were current in Athens in the fifth century. So similarly, for my purposes, I'm looking for stuff that is attested in Koine authors because lots of times, so I've been reading through Galen, um, the physician, and he's super interested. So he was a prolific writer. He wrote so much, and he was a doctor, right? So he was writing all about nutrition and food and the human body, and so it's like a treasure trove of really really interesting vocabulary. Um, and he like I sent you the other day. He has a recipe for tejanite for pancakes. And so I sent you the other day as like a little message. I found out how to say flip a pancake in Greek. That was that
So sorry, how
was
do you say it? I've forgotten.
so you just use the word strefin tejanete.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Huh.
yeah, so like turn it.
Yeah.
And he says, yeah, so he says, you're gonna want to flip the pancake two or three times, to make sure it's done on both sides. It's just really, really good, earthy vocabulary. But
Yeah.
anyway, so even in Galen, who is right in my time period, in the Koine period, he will flag some vocabulary that he uses as being Atticist. So he'll say
Hmm.
this is what the Atticists would prefer. We say the correct term according to them, one that is consistent with classical Attic usage.
Right.
And in the next sentence, usually he'll say, but what we call it nowadays is XYZ. And he's talking
Ah.
about in his context from Asia Minor in the second century, I believe. And he'll say, it's more important to me. He usually adds some kind of content, some kind of sentence like it's more important to me, to be understood by the layman than to use quote unquote the correct vocabulary. So that's really useful for me because that's evidence that the first term was obsolete or was very fringe by Galen's time period, and at the same time, he delivers the vocab that he would use, and that was current in that time period. So that's kind of a caution to people that it can be difficult just because you find something attested in an ancient Greek author doesn't mean it was necessarily attested for your time period, or even if it shows up in your time period, it wasn't necessarily the register you're looking for. So in
Hmm.
that case, like if Galen, is talking about turnips and, he has, the classical word for a turnip and, the everyday word for a turnip in the second century,
Yeah.
then I might take both of those and just in the dictionary I would flag one as archaic or obsolete or Attic,
Hmm.
and the other one as common or everyday. Another really good source for this is like Phrynicus, the second century Atticist, because he'll just give you like whole phrases and be like, everyone's saying this way. Don't say it like this. You should say it like this, and then he'll give the Attic equivalent. And so that's awesome for me because I'm like, oh, perfect. This is a second century witness telling me what people were saying on the street in the second century in Greek. Um, and so I can log that in my dictionary as maybe the colloquial variety, and then if the alternative that Phrynicus gives, if it seems to be like if he seems to imply that it would still be understood in the second century, then I'll want to put that as maybe a more like a higher register alternative to that. Does that make sense? Sorry, I've been going on for a long time.
No, no, it does. It makes perfect sense. And because I'm guessing like, we've got online databases and things of, ancient
Mm,
Greek all throughout, various Greeks, Homer. I mean, I think of the like Perseus, Scaphia viewer and stuff like that. I mean, like you could
yeah.
search across the whole corpus and find out if a word shows up in a period. But I'm guessing what you're talking about is more than just is the word attested. Is like, is this way of putting these words together attested? Um,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah,
a little harder to
it,
search for, correct?
it can be difficult sometimes. So like an example is in Phrynicus the other day I found he said don't say fqt, which in my pronunciation says epsilon upsilon kappa omicron iota epsilon iota. So he says don't say that because that's common, or that's that's debased, or he's harsh on that. But he's saying basically what he's saying is people are saying this, you shouldn't say it. And there's a lot of discussion about that word because people don't know exactly what it means. Apparently, it's not attested anywhere else in Greek literature before then, and or in the papyri. So I kind of did a deep dive on that, and I looked into it, and it seems to be a way of saying good night in Greek. Um,
Hmm.
so meaning, maybe a literal rendering would be like sleep well, and it seems to be the kind of thing you would say to someone when they're going off to sleep. So that's very interesting for me because it's kind of hard to find little nuggets like that
Yeah.
in literature because it's usually more highbrow stuff, and you usually don't have people saying good night to each other. Or it's recorded in the third person, like he wished him a good night or something like that, and they'll use
Yes.
a different word. So in that case, I would take that phrase and I can also flag it as tentative. I can say this isn't positive, and I can add a little editor's note and say this is where I found this in Phrynicus. He gives a little discussion of it, but it's not clear what it is. And then I can have like secondary sources too, and this article says it might mean this. This article says this, and you can just have that all recorded, and so you can have the word the phrase "good night" in your reverse English to Greek dictionary, but it'll have a little asterisk beside it, and you can say this is if this existed, if this was used in this way, then it was used at a very low social register, and it was disapproved of by the Atticists. So you can pack all that information into a good dictionary entry, and yeah, and you got to do some of the legwork, but I really think that's the way forward because it is kind of like the Wild West out there right now with active ancient Greek because there isn't really especially for people who are focusing more on Koine, there's really not much of uh, a like a consensus about even about correct archaic vocabulary, much less neologisms or something like that.
Right.
The Latin speaking community is much more cohesive on that point. They have a much longer tradition on that. There's a lot more consensus on that. So yeah, I mean, ideally, if it if when and if the dictionary gets up to that point, it'd be nice to have kind of a place where we can all go and be like, okay, this is kind of a an agreed on rendering of this common expression, or for neologisms. So I was the other day I did deep dive into gunpowder and firearms,
Oh, nice.
which obviously didn't exist in ancient Greece, but we have really really cool records from the 15th century about the first time that Greeks saw gunpowder and firearms in action, which was well, the main one was the siege of Constantinople in 1453, where it fell to Mehmet II of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, so he uses these enormous cannons, and we have eyewitnesses describing these machines. And it's so interesting the vocabulary that they use because they'll say they're writing in ancient Greek. It's Byzantine Greek, but trying to be as classicizing as possible. And they'll say there is no ancient word for these contraptions. He just calls it emechane, the machine. He's like, I don't know what to call this. You can call it elepolis, which is like that is an archaic word for like a siege engine, like the
Hmm.
taker of cities. Or you could call it apheterion, which is like a launcher. So like Josephus uses that word to describe some of the Roman war machines used in the first century against in quelling the Jewish revolt in AD 70. he says, or you can, and he gives a couple of other options. He says, I don't know what you should call this. And then he describes, how they use it. And he says, they feed it with this plant, he's describing gunpowder. Sometimes he'll say like the botane, like the plant, or
Huh.
like he'll say conis, which is like a powder, and then they'll put fire to it, and it launches these boulders into the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. But anyway, so you got kind of that vocabulary, and you can put a little asterisk beside it and say this was not present in the first century AD, which is my kind of my center, but this is kind of the closest thing we have to it. Another example would be I was looking for the word for well, I wasn't looking for the word. I stumbled upon it when I was reading an article, and I thought to myself, this is the perfect word for like a coffee machine. And what is called it's an ulisterion, and it's what it is like a wine filter. So what
Okay.
they did, so what they had was they had this bowl, and they would like bore holes into the bottom of it, and they would put it on this stand, um, over, and beneath it they would put like a cup, and they would put a filter into it, like a cloth around the inside of the bowl, and pour wine into it and let it percolate and drip down into the cup, and that was a way of like filtering the wine. And so I look at that and I'm like, this is so amazing. We have
Pour over
like,
coffee in ancient Greek, man.
yeah, well, I don't have the word for coffee yet, because that I think
Right.
that was a later product, and that'll be an interesting journey when the time comes. But that's the perfect way to describe. So you have the word for like trickling down or percolate. That's
Yeah.
an entry in the that's a head word. You have the word for the machine. You have a word for well, I already had a word for the cup beneath it, like a mug. But you have a word for coffee filter, which is they called it like a sakos,
Hmm.
that you would put over so like just like a cloth or something that you would
Yeah.
put over the mouth of it. So yeah, so these can all be indexed in the dictionary. You can, the like if you take the word coffee filter, that can, go to two different articles about, coffee and filter, and you click on coffee machine, that'll take you to machine, and index under machine will be coffee machine. So it's really, really useful to have the software. It's just kind of a repository for all this stuff. And something like that would be marked as a neologism, but you would also, it's also a pretty good approximation. Like in the editor's note, you could also say, this is a close approximate. For more precision, if you're trying to use a calc or a loanword or something, then you can say, and then just give like the transcription of coffee maker in English, or however you want to do it.
Yeah.
Maybe take the Neo-Latin term or something like that. But you can have that discussion. You can have like an article that goes into that, or like a paragraph. And then the ancient Greek speaking community has, a solid word for coffee maker that, is attested in papyri from the first, second century. And it's something that would have been familiar, at least the word is familiar, in the first century, and kind of the mechanism too. So it's not a perfect match, but neologisms are always going to be,
Yeah.
always going to be a little squirrely. But anyway, so that's something I've been enjoying doing recently. Neologisms for me are just kind of a means to an end, to an end. So like, if I wanted to talk about having breakfast in ancient Greek, then I'm not going to be able to get far if I don't have a word for orange or fork.
Right.
Um, and it's difficult because apparently I learned this in my research. Apparently, in the ancients only knew of one citrus fruit, and it wasn't the orange, it wasn't the lemon, it wasn't the lime, it wasn't the grapefruit, it was the citron, which
Okay.
is
Yeah.
yeah, which is not as familiar in the West. And the word for that in Greek was kytrion, and that was applied later in the Middle Ages when lemons were brought from, I think, from the Near East. That was applied to the lemon, and so that gave us the modern Greek kytrio for lemon.
Interesting.
And yeah, so you'd want to flag that in the dictionary. You'd want to say so you can say kytrion for lemon, but put a little asterisk beside that, and in the block, in the paragraph, say, we don't there this word doesn't exactly mean lemon. It means this slightly larger bulbous yellow fruit, in the citrus family, that later in medieval Greek became applied to the lemon. And so you can have that, discussion. You got a paper trail, and you can refer back to that, and people can make their own decisions if they want to say like limonion or something like that. Uh, that would be also another option. You could, like drawing from, various loan words or something. If they, if they really really wanted to, to keep the word for citron distinct from, the later application to lemon, then they could come up with another word, or use the Neo-Latin term or something like that. But
Yeah.
it would just be really helpful to kind of have this condensed. And the software is such that you can make an app out of something like this. You could print it. You could, just upload it online. Yeah, and so there's lots of resources for that. But anyway, so that's a project I've been working on recently. And yeah, it's also just a lot of fun. I get to read a lot of Greek.
I'm imagining too, like it would be pretty trivial to add a field that just tags like period. Like you could say classical Koine, whatever, and then it'd be quite easy later, in like
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, it can output like an XML file with all the data. So then that would be easy to
Oh
parse
yeah.
into a web app or a dictionary app that you could filter by period and all that stuff. So
My only concern is that it would be monstrous. It would be humongous if you wanted to have a single repository for Greek and or for classical and Koine, and or even Homeric or post-classical or post-Koine, later Byzantine. You could do all that, and index it under the same headwords, but that's kind of out of my range right now.
yeah,
I would love to see that if other people could do that though. What
well,
I
yeah, that might be
the
kind of interesting.
the way that I'm moving forward is I downloaded a list. It's freely accessible online, of the 10,000 most common English words, or the
Mhm.
most useful words for language learners in English, learning modern English. And I imported that as, HTML list, for and that was my automatic 10,000 headwords. And so basically what I'm doing is, for a while I went through alphabetically, just going through the A's, A, B, A, C, and just filling them in, with the best I could find. But the problem is really hard to search for Koine terms if there's no Koine to English to Koine dictionary. You kind of have to already know
Mm.
what you're looking for, or just assume that the classical one was still current in the Koine age. So I have access to the, thesaurus lingua graecae, so I can run searches, through all periods of Greek, and compare and contrast. But it's just a lot of work if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. So eventually, I switched um, to just reading widely, kind of reading in the field that I was interested in, and just the vocabulary just kind of bubbled up to the surface. So I've been reading Hero of Alexandria recently, who was first century inventor. So he talks about, mechanical robots that he would make, and
Hmm.
he even talks about, like, he's like, you can make this robot with like pulleys and, strings and stuff, and it'll act out a mythos, which is his word for like a script. Like you can make it, like, if it's a carpenter, then you can make it beat some metal, and then, or like cut some wood or something, and then walk across the stage and take a bow or something like that. And that's a good word for like programming or something like that. If you wanted to transfer that to modern robotics or something like that. So just serendipitous stuff like that, you run into, and then you go to the headword, and sure enough, program is one of the 10,000 most useful words in English, and you just fill that in, and you give the context, you give the time period, and you have a good Koine Greek reference for this really useful modern phenomenon.
That's really cool. So is that something that someone could collaborate with you on if they were interested? And if so, like, does that a software allow that, or how would they do that?
So I have you used this software before in the past? I'm not sure.
Is it Fieldworks Language Explorer?
Yeah, Fieldworks, the Flex language lexicon. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I
I've
used it in grad school, and I think I used it a little bit afterwards.
Yeah. So as far as I know, I've never collaborated with anyone, but there is a collaborate function, and you can like update each other on the progress you're making. It'll kind of be stored, um, in between the two systems. They'll like update each other's.
Hmm.
So I've never done that, and um, so it's definitely possible. I would definitely be open to it, but it's just a question of, um, not everyone has like, the time or the resources or the or frankly the interest to, like so I uh lots of the research involves just, combing through like, old German articles from the 1800s that, talk about the different kinds of, soap in antiquity, and, what the terminology was. And, this was
Mm,
body soap, and this was, this was like a, this was like for, for the face, and this was for the hair or something like that. And disambiguating that. And not everyone has the, the patience or the, inclination to do that. But yeah, no, I would be open to a collaboration, at some level at some point.
that's interesting. Well, I guess if people are interested in that, I mean, there's I know a few nerds that might be, and I think if you're listening to a podcast like this, you're probably you're probably at least much closer to the kind of nerd that would enjoy doing that than the
Mm,
average person. So,
mm.
um, maybe geek is a better term. I'm not sure. I guess I was.
Yeah, I haven't found a term for geek.
Oh yes, please. If you figure
Like
if you
it's,
figure nerd and geek out, please, by all means, add that.
I know in modern Greek they say phyto, which is like a plant, because you're always inside.
Okay,
But I doubt that goes very far back. I'll let you know when I find one.
that's funny. Well, hey,
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your book and again really and truly the lexicography project you're working on. If people are interested in connecting with you, where can they find you and stay up to date with what you're doing?
Yeah. So at this point, probably the best, most stable way would be to just communicate with my publisher. So Peter Gaiman at Sojourner Press. I believe it's sojournerpress.com. I might be wrong about that
Yeah, and I'll put that in the show notes.
website. Yeah, but yeah, just reach out to him, and yeah, he'd love to get in contact, and just follow up from there.
Well, yeah, cool. Well, I would definitely love to have you back at some point and talk about more results and cool words you found. That'd be kind of a really
Yeah.
like. Are you familiar with the Proof Text podcast that Glossa House puts out?
I am. I listen. I like listening to their stuff. The problem is they're so short that I have to keep going back, and like if I'm working out or something, I have to keep going back and refreshing, or clicking next or something. Uh,
It, it, it'd be kind of cool to like do something like that, just talking about like cool neologisms or things you found like every so
mm,
often. Do like a 5 minute episode to like, hey, I found the word for whatever. Like I don't know, maybe.
that would be good. That would keep my motivation up too, because I can can uh, can do a like uh, get too into it, burn myself out, and then take a few weeks to recover.
Yeah, no, I know how that goes.
Yeah,
Well, again, Timothy, thank you very much. And again, your book was Reading Greek with the Desert Fathers, and that's Sojourner Press, and that's the best place to keep up with you. So I'll add that all in the show notes, and we'll look forward to having you back at some point.
that's fantastic. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under Creative Commons 3.0 Attribution License. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.